The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I am the Training Peaks WKO4 product leader and will be guiding you through this webinar today. Starting on time, but it's so funny. I definitely see people jumping on and adding fast, so I always delay a little bit here in the beginning. Can everybody in a question, I know a lot of people know how to do this. Can you hear me and see my screen? If you could put that in a question box real quick, just so I can confirm, but it looks like you should be able to hear and see. Great. Thank you, everybody. Awesome. Okay, let me just set up my screen here. Let's go ahead and get started. It looks like most people are squeezing in right now. With today's webinar, as with any webinar, actually start at the beginning. Today's webinar is demystifying the power duration curve. This has often been, somewhat, I wouldn't call it problematic. It's been frequently asked. Finally, just with different questions, I decided to do a webinar with some insight and overview of what we did, why we did it, and how it works. This webinar is a little more conversational, meaning I'm just going to lay out some of the principles, but hopefully by doing that, kind of guide you through everything it does and does not do. I'm just getting over. I've been traveling a lot, so of course I picked up the flu somewhere, so my voice is going to be a little on and off. I have a big glass of water, really tequila, here, so if I have to stop and take a drink every once in a while, excuse me. Like that. All right, getting started. Please ask questions as we go. Again, I always appreciate if you ask the questions as we go because I can basically just weave them into the presentation. It's always easier than coming back later and trying to answer questions, 20 minutes after the point was made. Feel free putting them in. I'm looking at a different screen. You can put them in simply by out of your control panel. You can open and close that by this little orange/red arrow. Find the questions area, and down here it allows you to enter a question for staff. I see that off here on my other screen. So ask away as we go, particularly this webinar because it's more conversational and I want you to understand all aspects of the model. So the reality is when we start talking about demystifying the power duration curve, you really have to start with what's happened with the athlete of late. So when we sat down and we did WKO4, one of the things that we knew was just going to be a struggle, particularly when we started doing it, which I guess was about 5 years ago, is we saw this rapid acceleration in really device gathering elements. So, I'm sorry, data gathering devices, I should say, and all the elements that went with them. We saw, new metrics, new information, new data. And really what we knew would be in the future step would we need to better utilize science, information, and technology to make a WKO4 a more vibrant product, but also to give the tools to coaches to do a better job than they've ever been able to do before. When we started doing that, we decided what we really needed was to start at the beginning. And we decided to do was to build a human performance model. So to explain the whole power duration curve, and how and why and everything that we did, first we need to start with understanding the human performance modeling or understanding human performance modeling. Human performance modeling is data-driven development and application of predictive, reliable, and executable quantitative models of human performance. And there's a couple of key words in there, right? Predictable, reliable, and quantitative should jump right out. When you're building a human performance model and something that predicts or estimates or demonstrates performance, you really need those three, or actually having a model that doesn't give you those three is much worse. You're better off guessing. So when we started, obviously our initial goal was, as we figured out we needed one, we wanted to build one that was predictive, reliable, and quantitative. When we thought about why, what we're building and what we really at the core wanted to accomplish, it really is an evolution of what's happening in training, coaching and training. We wanted to take and create data that has historically only been available in the lab to the people who can, one, access a lab, two, afford a lab, and then three, go through the difficulties of suffering like that guy probably is, to generate, certain information, athlete data, physiological aspects of the athlete. The reality is the evolution that's happening now with all of this data, the lab is really becoming the math. We're able to model more and more accurately this human performance element. When we look at modeling, we're not the first ones to do it by far. Modeling and performance modelings have been around in endurance sports for a while. It really goes back to Bannister and the Bannister model, and it was a pretty good initial model. Busso came along and really refined the Bannister model. The Bannister model had some challenges of the way it dealt with time, and Busso kind of sort of tweaked and fixed those. But then about 4 or 5 years ago, Dr. Andrew Coggin, who really is the physiologist behind the power duration curve model, Andy came along and the way I like to summarize it, he both refined and simplified the Bannister model. The Bannister model and the basis of that was pretty complex. That basically, that product, that model that he designed is the power duration curve, which lives in WKO4 and what we're here to talk about today. Most people on this call are at least familiar with that power duration curve and what it is, but basically it is exactly as we named it. It's a curve. It's a representation of the power duration relationship of the athlete over time. So you have to ask yourself, why did we build a power duration curve model? It's important you understand the why of what we're doing, because one of the things I'm going to attempt to do here today is change your perspective. Some people I know understand this well, but change your perspective of the whole process of power duration and modeling. So why did we build it? Well, because having a robust mathematical description of an individual's power duration relationship helps assure the accuracy and stability of the outputs of further calculations based upon this description. It's almost like I should have highlighted further calculations. So the reality is having this robust mathematical relationship really assures the stability or the accuracy and the stability of the output data. To do what we wanted to do, and I'm going to get into output data a little bit here, we needed it to be accurate. We needed it to work. The challenge is, though, in the absence of a model, if you look at the model, I'm going to break down what we just seeing. This is your mean maximal power curve, right? And this is just Jim Ryder here over 2017. We can see his curve has got some shape to it. So really what you're talking is we need to take this mean maximal power relationship, which is simply a peak for every second across the power duration relationship, and change it into a smoother, more accurate second by second model. So basically this becomes this. Looking at them together, you can see they're different, right? The power duration curve itself is smoother and tends to reside within the mean maximal power points. So if your mean maximal power here in the yellow dots, and I bet you most of yours will look similar. Maybe the numbers will be different, but will look similar. Really, the reality is you have the mean maximal power and the power duration curve. The reason we can't do a lot of the extended modeling behavior is the mean maximal power curve itself is simply too noisy. And by noisy, it means you have minor fluctuations in the data that actually, when you look to do the things we wanted to do, made the math, I wouldn't say inaccurate, but let's call it unstable. So, and the reality is we're going to have some people on this that understand modeling and math really well. Just know I'm going to be giving some short answers to models. The reality is with this shape of the curve is what's known as sigmoidal, and it's a sigmoidal curve. So a sigmoidal curve is really like a simple definition, but it is important that people understand it. The shape sense of sigmoid is most often used in scientific context to describe an S-shaped curve or graphic. So the reality is it is an S-shaped curve and graphic. But the reality, for those who know a little bit more about math, there's actually a sigmoidal function or going on underneath the process and what drives that curve. Why is it sigmoidal? Well, here's something to start thinking about, right? When you look at this power duration curve and it's representative of the power duration relationship of that individual athlete, one of the things that's happening, right, is you have three energy systems. You could say two, but let's just call it three for argument's sake at the moment. You have two which are anaerobic and one which is aerobic. The athlete themselves, each individual, moves through those energy systems differently. So how you utilize ATP, glycogen, carbohydrates, all the different systems, two of which are anaerobic. You can be alactic and lactic, and one of which is aerobic. The reality is we all move through these different energy slash metabolic systems in different amount of power outputs. We're not the same. We utilize that energy differently. We produce power with that energy differently. We produce velocity with that energy differently. When you look at these systems, they are transitional. It's not a light switch. As a matter of fact, all three systems are actually running at all given times. It's just a matter of which one is dominant. So you begin to, and that's a slight overstatement, but most people will understand that. The reality is, when you look at this relationship utilization of the energy system, the reality is this is how you produce power. So you have in its simplest terms, you have a muscular side, but you really have an underlying biochemical side of this, which is really your ability to produce or generate power over time. To be able to understand how this happens through the three systems, basically a sigmoidal curve is the best representation because it moves in the shape of the human performance, human power duration relationship. Well, is this model accurate? Well, I've shown this before. We've tested the model pretty extensively. Long story short, and Dr. Andy Coggan did 4 different webinars on the model development and its accuracy. You can always go back and look those up and find them. A couple quick summaries. We compared it against critical power and other different well-known models, and we believe we have the least amount of bias or the most accuracy within our model outputs. When you look at different models and their residuals, we'll talk a little bit about residuals. You can see that each model has some different reality in its residuals. Our distribution of normalized residuals for the WKO4 model is pretty tight. You can see most of the things happening here in the slightly plus range, but you're really talking about a pretty low level of variation, of bias. So if the model's pretty accurate, we believe it's the most accurate one out there and what's happening. But a lot of people wonder about that and ask, can I check the model? Yeah, one of the things we wanted to do was to give you a built-in system to see and check the accuracy of your model. So the reality is you do have a chart called PD curve chart with error calculations. A lot of people should be familiar with it. It'll look exactly like it's on my screen. And if you look here in the top right, we're using some different math formats to validate the model. And we simply can show you the plus minus of power and actually a percentage of the actual number, which will show you how much it might be off for select points within the model. Select parameters is the correct word. So you typically will see this under 3%. When it starts getting maybe 2.5 and above, you typically either you have some bad data, like a poor calibration or some other things, or maybe you've done just one type of hard effort and everything else has been super easy and super slow. It just basically points out there's some oddity or some noisiness with your data that the model isn't fully able, and dealing with well. But you would typically see percentages under 2.5% and pretty darn tight. You could always check that. Another check, it's funny, somebody asked me yesterday, and I didn't even think to say it because I'm so used to looking at it, is do a visual check. You can see here there is a clear relationship between the power duration curve and the mean maximal power. Now, there are points where mean maximal power might be slightly higher than your curve. For those of you who know about a critical power model, the critical power model tends to bump across the top and then assume you can do higher power in all the in-between places. We needed a model that was more representative of the athlete themselves, which I'm about to get in deeper out. So our model has a better fit to all of the data. Again, I'm going to go deeper into that. Another way you can check, and it's funny, this is now loaded in your library if you haven't used this chart. It's called your Coggan normalized residuals charts. And what it's showing you, I'm going to go a little deeper into this later, but it shows you the amount of bias by time range. But I'll explain it a little later. So you have two good charts that will really give you some insight and some checking about your model itself. So now we have an accurate, robust mathematical description of the individual's power duration relationship. So what do we use it for? Well, so far, the perceived answer has been to predict power at various durations. And I can tell you one of the places, not for lack of trying, but I have not done a good job as the product leader in getting people to understand the model is everybody believes that's why we built a model. The reality is that answer is incorrect. We did not build a model to predict power at various durations. We wanted to go beyond that. You can do that sort of out of a critical power model or all different ways. We wanted something better. We wanted to leap right over that to something more effective in the world of endurance training. So if you take away things from this meeting, you will understand that that should be one, right? So a question I got on the last slide, I received on the last slide was, and I missed it, is the power duration curve based off normalized power or actual power? It's based off actual power. One of the other flaws in normalized power, I remember normalized power is an algorithm that is meant to show the stress, the outside force being applied to your body, the stress or quantitative force of that ride or run, right, of that exercise or that workout. Normalized power is not a substitute for power. It doesn't mean you have more power. It could mean that. It could be an indicator because normalized power really is the physiological stress because it indicates how hard you could have went if you would have produced that power in a more steady state fashion. So the model is based off average power. So going back to this point about predicting power at various durations, our goal was not that. Our goal was to quantify physiological attributes. This probably is the most important slide if you really want to grasp what we're doing, because it's also going to get insight into what's going to be happening in the future. So first off, when you have a model has parameters, right? And the parameters of the model are real physiological things, not a power number, right? So the reality is the model itself, right, best replicates or best indicates real physiological things. It's funny, that's Kevin's way of saying it, so I stole it for this webinar. And the point of things is it does a bunch of physiological stuff. So we weren't trying to output power metrics. We were trying to create a program, a model that gave insight into physiology, not power. Power is a result of that physiology because you are producing power, over the course of that power duration relationship through different systems, different energy systems, metabolically different. But we wanted to look at the underlying physiological things, those energy systems, your physiological properties and propensities. So the goal was that. So put that in your mind. And as we go through the rest of this, I think you'll begin to see what we did in a slightly different light. These critical physiological parameters are derived without the need for formalized testing. We wanted to move away from this idea of formalized testing. It's funny when I say that, I mean both in a lab or even originally when I wrote it, I meant in a lab, but I also mean in a road as far as, some restrictive power, time-based test. The reality is, you can do this if you have just some good hard data. You can make the power model work. These physiological things are quantified measurements of the energy system. Could we quantify this energy system and more? We wanted to do more, but could we quantify it? And the reality is it's done a pretty good job at that. Right now, you have some basic ideas like Pmax, which is a muscular event, but it also is an ATP, how you utilize energy or biochemical at that stage. And again, an oversimplification in these next couple of red points. You have anaerobic power being defined by functional reserve power. You have aerobic power being defined by functional threshold power. You could call TTE an aerobic endurance. I don't like that word aerobic endurance because it's used for a lot of terms, but I think you get the point. You have stamina and things like that and more. So, matter of fact, if you just look at the core of what you have, this is a great little summary. We have simple phenotyping where we're simply lumping using all of this most of this physiological data to understand and phenotype and group. We have Pmax, FRC, MFTP, stamina, and TTE as hero bar metrics, which allow you to better understand your athlete. We also have model VO2 max, model fiber type. We have an enhanced power profile because of this model. We no longer just have like 4 or 5 key time points. We have every single second. And we have ability to do things like elevation corrected power. And the elevation corrected power in WKO4 is based off your power duration model. It's why it's pretty accurate. The reality is what this group of metrics is doing, and there are more metrics, is it's giving you a full 360-degree view of the performing athlete. And that is such a shift. Go back and think about what you were doing 3-4 years ago or 2-3 years ago before you started using WKO4. You were looking at FTP and some power numbers. Now you really have a broad understanding of the athlete's physiology. Both when they first come to you and you just download data and you can be like, oh, I could, I see this person's their curve shape. I see these outlying metrics. I understand them better. So it really has been a powerful thing. We wanted to give that full 360 look. I have definitions for those different ones. I'm not going to go over them because everyone knows here, but I wanted to make sure it was in the presentation as people watch it in the future who might be new. So I have them in there. The end goal of the model, right, was simple with all of this. And I know there's some questions piling up, but I'm getting to them. The end goal of the model was simple. The end goal was to more closely estimate the performing athlete's current physiology. So if we could estimate your current physiology, you could basically track that back over time, right? And if we have all of those metrics I just showed you, and then you could look at them over time, you have an excellent tool for understanding a lot about that athlete, which I'm going to get into. Why develop a system of modeling the physiology of human performance? Simply, we see it as the evolution of training. Accurate human performance modeling allows us to evolve training to really focus on the individual. So we go from random training to generalized training to individualized training. And actually, if you watch what all the people are doing on the Facebook group, and I see people doing it this way all the time, and we coined this phrase in our little group, you're really training by this individual training footprint. We're understanding the footprint of the athlete, the footprint of their response to training, and each athlete's footprint is unique. Excuse me, needed water. Each athlete's footprint is unique. Now, in the past, you wouldn't even have known necessarily, or potentially might not have known it was unique. Now, not only you have an in-depth understanding of the fact that it is unique, you understand it deeper. What's this individual training footprint? Really, it's individualization of training, which I've kind of presented before. You have the ability to quantify and view the underlying physiology of the athlete. How many times as a coach have you had an athlete come to you, they have a couple of years of data, you really have to comb through the athlete to try to figure out how they perform. Reality is now you can load that data, look at the model, look at the metric outputs, get immediate insight into that athlete. We can better identify specific relative strengths and weaknesses, not just some select time frames against power. Now we can really understand their relative strengths and weaknesses from a physiological level or from a power output level or any way you want to look at it. Finally, the dose-response relationship not only measured as power, heart rate, but as that actual underlying physiology. So as an athlete's FRC goes up or their Pmax goes up, we have the ability to understand what's happening at the metabolic level, at the physiology or the physiological level, and how that's affecting the athlete. It also gives you a great way of communicating to your athlete. As you know, sometimes all gains aren't always seen, and athletes are always looking for motivation. Having all these different metrics are a great way to explain what's happening to your athlete as they go through training phases. Individual insights. The reality is a robust and evolving model. Remember, it's always evolving. The more data you put in, the more it evolves. Well, I should say the more current the data, the more it evolves. It allows us to better understand the performing athlete's physiology, which improves the efficacy of your training. You get more effective at training. Why? You have accelerated insight into response and adaptations. I think, and it's so important, that's why our little tagline, that lower left, is insight accelerated. One of the things we wanted to give coaches through these physiological metrics, this quantified look at the underlying physiology and metabolic effects, is to give you insight at a faster rate. So as you apply a training strategy, you can see if it's working faster. As a matter of fact, and I got this question 2 or 3 times last night, it helps you create training strategy, because as you think about a hypothesis of I want to train this athlete this way, I think they would benefit of this, you can go back and look at training. There's ways you can build charts and do unique things in that athlete's history and look to see if there's a dose response relationship, which is another way of accelerating insight. You can begin to validate your training strategy or training hypothesis for that particular athlete before you even, or as you write it, I should say. Improved understanding of environmental effects. One of the things that gets lost in the sauce here is we have the ability now in a better way than ever, and there's, I don't know, one of the things I shouldn't say, but there's more cool stuff coming. 2018 is going to be kind of cool in a couple of ways, and this environmental is one. You can see how heat, altitude, fatigue, and fatigue's not really environmental, but you'll see how different things affect the athlete. You can begin to separate that data, which has been extremely useful for me as a coach for a couple of specific reasons. And then I already touched on the historical performance data to validate strategy or coaching. Now, here's like the third note you should take today. You want to take a big takeaway. This is it. The power duration curve is not a method of training. It is a robust method of testing the efficacy of the selected training method. So at times, I know there's been some, particularly of recent, some new training methods and new multi-focus systems, and you know, we're not just looking at threshold anymore, all these different functions. That's fine. We're not a training system, but you can look at all of those or the other online systems that predict your power and do all those things. Great. People ask me all the time, do those work? And I say, I don't know. Test them, load them, look at the data, vet what's happening. If you can see your underlying physiology, if you can understand if it's working for you, then great. If it works for you, great. You know, that's, you know, an important role that all of this data will can. The power duration curve is not a training method. You as the coach are still the artist. You as the self-coach athlete are still the commander of your own fate. Now, does it make the cycles of insight, tweaking, edit, you know, new training faster, better, stronger? Hopefully. Does it allow you to test all of these new things coming to market with the next greatest answer to training? Hopefully. You know, and then the reality is if you can do those two, you become the training expert. You become that athlete's, you know, your own, if you're self-coaching, your own best friend, because you don't have to guess, is this working? Or you fully understand how it's working. So that's an important thought. So what does the model need to do its job? Well, first, it just needs a tad of understanding, kind of which I'm giving you here, right? The thing is, I think a lot of people are so focused on the model and it doesn't predict my FTP correctly. just understand everything we're saying here. And I think we're getting, we're making some ground with a lot of the newer people in this. But it's also important for you to understand, and this is where it gets lost a lot in the Facebook group. And this is my fourth take a note point. The model describes your fitness based on what you did. It does not predict what you might be able to do if you try harder. So the model really just says it's all based on what you've done. It assumes you're doing some maximal efforts at different levels. If you want a program that you can do a 3-minute all-out effort and it can tell you how hard you can go for 60 minutes, that's not what we do. Let me be crystal clear. It's not what we do because we don't believe in that kind of training. That's why we don't support it. We don't believe in guessing or just. And don't get me wrong, I train and myself, and I just estimate my FTP because I'm not training to race. But and I estimate it by just guessing. That's what I do. I know it and I guess. But for people that are seriously training or working with athletes, I would never do that with my athletes. I never just predict. Testing and having the right information is so important, and that goes beyond FTP. So the model describes your fitness based on what you did, not potentially what you could do. If you think you could do more, go do it, and the model will pick it up. Now, what does the model need to work? It needs an accurate range of performance data, which is at least 30 days, but preferably 90 days. So it needs 30 to 90 days of accurate data of an athlete performing. That includes some max efforts and what I would call the short, medium, and long durations. I'll show a slide in that in a second. And that could be variable, but the reality, it needs a little bit of each. If you're not testing, this can often be done in race seasons. You'll get all the right data. If you're riding throughout the winter at zone 2 on your trainer all winter long without ever testing, you're not giving it enough data to really do its job. So the reality is, go back to the point I was just making, it's describing what it sees. It's not estimating or predicting what you could do. Now, when the model sees a new input, a peak, it means the model learned something new about you. Not that your fitness changed in one day. I see people who post at times and say, I did this, and I'm going to give you some common issues here in a moment where I'll take you through some of these examples. But I did this, and bam, my model changed. I just got that much fitter. Well, that's probably not true. It just learned something new about you. And the model, as your fitness was evolving or de-evolving, that it's really just learning that. So it's not, if you ride along all winter long and the trainer just doing zone 2, and then suddenly you get your bike outside and you crush a 1 minute and a 40 minute, and then everything moves significantly, that doesn't mean your fitness just suddenly changed. It just means that you gave the model new information and it learned something new about you. When you think about this short, medium, long time frames, I always recommend an unstructured testing approach. This is nothing new. Simple way you can do it is you can pick places where the mean maximal power line drops underneath your power duration curve and see if you can push it up. If I was this athlete, I would do about a 15-second test, maybe a 90-second test, and yeah, a 40-minute test. You can see this athlete probably has been doing, well, maybe even not, it drops off before 20 minutes, but the reality is I might look at a 40-minute test for this athlete. So the reality is the testing can be unstructured, and once up and running, it's very easy to maintain the curve, but it does require some testing. A point I make all the time, I'm not testing to maintain the model. I don't really care about the shape of this. What I really want, and I do, but is the output metrics. I want to understand what is happening in the athlete themselves. What might break the model? We talk about feeding it. Well, garbage in, garbage out, data spikes and poor calibration are the number 1 and number 2 killers. And then you have this performance lack of max data. Exactly what I'm talking about. Drone on the trainer all winter long and no testing. And it really won't tell you what you can do. It's just going to tell you what you are doing. Now, one of the things you can look at your model, I said this earlier and I said I would come back to it, and I actually put it what the model needs, because when I wanted to show the testing or the high efforts or the unstructured testing that I just showed, you have this chart, Coggan normalized residuals. Andy just wrote a chart that shows, and basically what it's doing, it's showing the model bias at certain time frames. So this dashed line is 0. This is when the bias is positive. This is when it's negative. The further it moves away from 0, the more something is odd in that time range. Now, odd it might be your single maximal effort, like you haven't done anything, close to that in some time range, or it could be an underperforming area. It could be bad calibration, bad data. There's lots of things it could be. So basically, this, you could actually do your unstructured testing off. So I would pick, so here's negative. Typically, it's going to be between, it should always be under 10%. Hopefully, it's sort of under 5 if your model's under 5. So if the model's under 5, percent, it's pretty clean. If it's between 5 and 10, it's good, but maybe could be cleaned up a little more. So I would test here. It's the same. I think this is the same person. Yeah, like 15 seconds here at 90 seconds and here again at 40 minutes. So yeah, it's the same athlete clearly. What is the math behind the model? So this is a question. I got a couple of questions on this. So a few points about the mathematical basis. The main point is it's proprietary and black box. We do not answer questions about the math, but I want to explain why, right? Because we take heat for this at times. Every single thing, and I could totally understand Dr. Andrew Coggan's feedback or frustration here. Every time we create something, it gets the idea and often the math get borrowed, right? And it's like we are constantly focused on innovation, and whereas in, I don't know, it kind of is sad that occurs. The reality is you just get to a point where it's like, wow, we published everything originally. Now everybody uses things like normalized power and the PMC and all of that stuff, but they don't even give credit back for where it came from. And that reality is that's hurt us in a lot of different ways. So now, unfortunately, in today's world, we keep it proprietary and black box. Another question I got yesterday, and I actually just got right now, is why don't we patent it? Because the reality is if you patent a formula, you have to publish it. If somebody took that published formula and changed one number, it's not infringing in the world. So we black box it, we keep it to ourselves. I had a couple of questions about what it's based on and stuff like that. I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer that. But to the two questions I got about data points, it uses all data points. It uses all data points. And the reality is the model is a form of regression to improve accuracy and fit. For those who know, math know that regression means it's looking at multiple variations to get that best fit. So it's a form of regression. I've already showed you we supply the tools to validate. And this is funny, people don't understand it. We can validate that the math is right, but yet people will say, no, it's still wrong. I could do more. Maybe you could, but the math will be, just go to that error, what I showed you right here. Right there, you could just look at it, you'll understand the percentage variation. Now, you might believe your power meter's wrong or you could do more or whatever, and that's great. I get it. Go for it. Don't forget, our model, the reason we use this is it aligns with physiological outputs. We actually could have built a model that could have predicted things like FTP better. But we wanted all the parameters, that's an important mathematical word, to align with physiological outputs. So I've gotten this question like 5 or 6 times now. You can't find the normalized residuals chart. To update the chart library, you must sync with Training Peaks. So it probably means you haven't synced your WKO4. Sync your WKO4 and it will show up as a new chart and give you a little alert. So just sync your Training Peaks. All right. The next step, common issues. Sorry, there's a roll of questions coming in right now, and I said that. Shane, I see your question. I'll answer it in a little bit. Remind me at the end if I don't, because there are definitely questions coming in hot and heavy. Common issues with the model, right? Just to tackle this up front. Simplest one, my PDC won't calculate, my power duration curve won't calculate, and has dashes in my hero bar. It'll look like this, right? Dash, 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 dash. And if you look at your mean maximal power, there's no red curve here, and it typically has one of these. This is a power spike. The simplest answer is fix the power spike. It really is. So many people say, well, how can 1 second so affect it? Remember, the model is smart. It knows if the data is inaccurate and it does not calculate. It knows if the data will throw off one of the physiological parameters. So in this case, it might throw off, it actually throws them all off. That data spike is pretty impactful, but it would particularly throw off Pmax. So it doesn't calculate. So if you have a data spike, you can use the data spike chart pack to correct it. Just search your library, data spike chart pack. Then you can simply hover over the bad data and collect it. I put in this presentation, and we can send the presentation out. I meant to attach it to this meeting, the link to a help article to teach anybody how to do that. Now let's get into more interesting common issues. So this common issue, I've been doing some solid base training and just crushed a new 1 minute peak, and my MFTP went down. WTF? Now I'm going to go for the 2-for-1 special here. My MFTP is too low, lower than my set FTP. What causes this often is the same result as this. So I'm going to tackle these two at once. So first, let me explain FTP a little bit deeper for everybody, and hopefully maybe even simpler. And I know Coley Moore just wrote a great article on this. He posted it in the Facebook group. I actually have a link to it here coming up in a couple of slides. I'd really encourage you to read it. It was a great explanation. He uses the same chart. He colorized it a little differently, and his names might be slightly different, but this is my version, but I think you'll get the idea. The chart's name is called FTP Contribution with TEE. It's in your chart library. The red line is your power duration curve, right? And this is the robust mathematical model of your power duration relationship in a sigmoidal shape. See how much learning you already have today? Now, what we have is a couple of other lines in this. And let's talk about what these are. FTP is aerobic and most correlated with maximal lactate steady state. This has long been known and tested. Maximal lactate steady state, we start getting in the thresholds, and you can watch my building FTP, building threshold, I think is the webinar name. I give about, 12 different slides on LT1, LT2, onset of blood lactate, maximal lactate, FTP. It's all described there pretty well. But the reality is FTP most correlates with maximal lactate steady state. And that's a crucial number and a key number for understanding training intensities and efforts. Now, if we understand that, put that in the background, knowing it's aerobic, right? What we also have is this blue line in my chart. This is your FRC, or your anaerobic contribution to the power duration curve, to the red line. And this green line, right, that is your FTP curve, or your aerobic contribution to the power duration curve. So what you're seeing here at any given time is how much power you're making. So take this 20 minutes where I have the cursor held. At 20 minutes, this athlete is making 11 watts from their anaerobic system, and they're making 222 watts from their aerobic system. The red line, the power duration model, is a combination of these two. So you notice here, 11 anaerobic watts plus 22 aerobic watts equal 233 watts, right? But the reality, FTP is the aerobic portion of that. It's this line. Notice how these two lines align until it begins to drop off right at this time to exhaustion, right before time to exhaustion, to be technically correct. It is not the combination of these two. That is the power output. Your FTP is the aerobic side. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, and it's not like you're getting exactly 11 watts and exactly 222. It's a model, and some of that's coming pass through might be the more physiological term, or some of that happens differently in this crossover, but the reality is it gives you excellent insight into how those energy systems, remember I showed you in the sigmoidal curve, are happening. So what happens, right, when you go out and you crush that, you have your already set FTP and you go out and crush that 1 minute effort, the model sees more of the anaerobic contribution. So it sees more of this. So it knows that the way you've been making power is actually less of this. The aerobic goes down because the model learned something new about you. It learned something new about you, right? So now that the model knows something new about you, it is utilizing that data to better understand the underlying physiology and correct. It doesn't mean your FTP went down. It meant probably it was slightly overstated. So it corrects it because it's a combination of the two, right? Your power duration curve itself is the combination of the both. So that might move, but your FTP might go lower because it is not, your FTP is not a combination of those two. So the reality is when you're introducing, particularly in that type of scenario, right, some new high-end data, you can have what we call the FRC FTP teeter-totter. When the model suddenly sees a more FRC and it will end up with less aerobic FTP, right? So it's a little bit of a teeter-totter. People will ask me, and keep the questions coming, you guys. I'll get to them, but I lost track. It's pretty big, so I'm kind of starting at the last one again. People ask then, well, wow, does that mean my FTP has been too high all along and I've been training in the wrong zones, and what should I do? You know, to be honest with you, one of the reasons we did what we did was, yes, we saw way too many people training in too high of a threshold because we wanted to make that number bigger because it was important to us to be bigger. But the reality is we also then, as we looked more and more, understood how individual that really was. And that's the exact reason we created eye levels. It's exactly why we did it. We wanted to not just solve the problem by giving you a better FTP. Remember, our goal of all of this was to jump right beyond, not just make a better critical power model, not just better predict your FTP. We wanted to jump beyond it and actually give you better tools to just do the right thing, not necessarily have a bigger FTP number. That's why we did eye levels. So how can you correct those, or what should you do if you run into that common issue? Here's my answer, right? Accept it or test it. And everybody knows on Facebook, that's usually my answer. I kind of go there pretty quick. I can tell you that when Andy and I and the team were building this model, I tried to break it time and time again, much often, to my painful demise. I don't think I ever actually broke the model, even running some, unique training and different things against it. But the reality is you need to accept or test it. First off, you could validate it. Go look at the numbers. There is a great chart, which I'll show here in a minute, called FTP contribution, which I haven't shown yet, which will give you some insight. But if you don't believe it's true, go out and test it. Go past that 20-minute test that we all seem to like and see if you can do more. And I will typically bet on the model as long as you have decent data in there. But the reality is, if the model's wrong, it will correct itself because it'll learn something new about you. But more times than not, the model is a little more accurate than you might want to think. Two great articles. This is Coley's article, and this is Frank Overton linked to that same communication, an older article on maximal lactate steady state. Frank's is on maximal. Coley's article is really exactly explaining what I just explained to you in a better, smarter way. Another common issue, my MFTP doesn't match my last 20-minute test. I'm not going to do this to you, but here. Does this look familiar? The answer is usually exactly the same. It's just happening out here and not here where I pointed arrows to. You still get a significant amount, or well, it depends what you call significant, and it's individual, of anaerobic capability affecting that number. Not all of us fit within the 95% rule. Probably about half of all athletes do, and the other, it might be 92, you might be 97%. only one way to find out. The same truth goes for 60-minute normalized power. Andy and Hunter, Andy did the 60-minute normalized power. He never meant it to be like, here's an absolute. It was just another way to estimate. As a matter of fact, it's one of the 7 deadly sins. Two, I've seen people have messaged me on Facebook about why did Hunter then put the 20-minute testing protocol in the book. Look, you guys, Hunter's been around for a while. He knows what he's doing. And this is tough, and I've learned this as a lesson time and time again. You got to be careful when everyone's looking at what you're doing. You got to be careful what you write, because people take a suggestion as an absolute. And I think that's what's happened here. I think people wanted the 20-minute test to be perfect because it's easier. So they took the suggestion, and Hunter was really just saying, hey, here's a good way to estimate, right? And a pretty good average. But I don't think his point was that there isn't a better way, or doing it with a correct testing time length. Andy would say 40 kilometers. I would say long and unstructured and use the model, but there's different ways to look at it. I do believe, and I've seen time and time again, the 20-minute test overestimates threshold and leads athletes to train at intensities that are too high. If you're that person, how can you fix it? The same effect. I would use eye levels anyway, right off the bat. That's the easiest way to fix it. Don't just try to predict a better FTP. Just, as long as you've had the good data in the model, use the eye levels. Oftentimes when I see the over-reliance on the 20-minute test and people say I'm stronger, then this is what their combination of measured and modeled, MMP and power duration curve looks like. I always see this. This is a over-testing athlete, right? Look, sprint, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute. And then they're just not doing a lot of any work in between. But this athlete might say, but look how much above my MMP is above the curve. I could do more further out. Well, there really is not a lot of evidence to support that, is there? You can see how much it dips under here. Again, you could validate it with error corrections. This is a great chart. FTP performance history. It's in the power duration curve pack also. And basically it's showing you your peak 20-minute 95%, your peak 60-minute NP, your modeled threshold, your peak 60-minute AP, right? So many people say, no, I know my threshold's higher, and I ask them to post this picture in Facebook, and it only gets posted about half the time, because I think when people look at it, they go, maybe it's not really higher. It tends to track really well. Now, if you have purple dots and blue lines over the orange, yeah, let's take a look at that. You might be having a problem. You might have some bad data. You might have some bad testing. But generally, if none of those go over, the model's probably more accurate than your assumption. Just is the truth. Action, same action. I didn't change it. The reality is you got to, if all of these answers is accepted or tested, it really is that. 2 more. I've been resting for the last 45 days, and now I'm training again, but my PDC and MFTP are too high. This is an issue we have, and Kevin and I are working some solutions for future rollouts for future versions. I think you guys are on 375. Me and him are testing some things in 376 or whatever the number is. We're trying to find a little easier way to do this for you guys. But what I do in the detraining phase after resting is I always make sure I have detraining charts. I call them detraining, and I shared this in the chart library. You can find it by this name, MFTP ranges for detraining. And all I'm doing is running a model based off 90 days, or MFTP in this case, based off 90, 42, and 28 days. So you can see the 90 model. You can see this athlete stopped training in here. They stopped training, probably right here, right? So they're detraining. You can see that the 42 and 28 days give me a little better insight into the decline. Whereas the orange, the 90-day, has a slower degradation half-life, right? What's funny, this athlete, I know who Jim Ryder is, and he came to one of our camps about 2 weeks ago. And he took some time off here, and then he started training really hard to get in shape for camp. So look how quickly the 42-day shows kind of his form, and camp was out here. I haven't updated it. it's an interesting take to look at these over different day points. You could do the same in curves. So all this is 3 power duration curves. I bet you can't see that color differentiation, but there's actually 2 curves side by side there. A 90-day, a 42-day, and a 28-day curve. And these are just power duration curve detraining review. You can look these up and take a pack at them. All in there for your use. So just review and correlate those charts. It's a little bit of an art right now, but we are looking some ways to deal with that detraining phase a little better. So when you start back up, the other thing, it works its way out pretty quickly. Once you get rolling along, the model picks up and things will kind of fix, but it does leave that little lag time where you as the coach have to look at those 28, 42, 90-day modes. And most of us have some unique charts. Like you can run eye levels by that. You can run optimized intervals by 28 or 42 days. So I just have a unique chart set for that time period. Final question, and then I'm going to get to the buildup of questions that have been happening. Sorry about that. I've been riding the trainer all winter, doing some base work, and my MFTP seems low. I don't even have a chart to show that because there's so many different versions, right? Just look up. We have plenty of charts that show if you tag your trainer rides, you and the trainer, and you not. But the reality is every time I see that point, I ask the person, have they done any hard riding? They say no. And really, I've already answered that a couple of different times, right? The model only predicts what you, or it only describes what you've done. It doesn't predict what you could do if you go harder. But search the chart library. There's a lot of cool charts in there that could help on that factor. Okay, so I'm going to jump into questions and answers. Feel free to add yours now if you haven't already. I'm going to go backwards through some of these questions and see what I can answer versus what I missed. Yeah, so somebody's asking about what would you do at least 40 minutes to get a decent estimate of MFTP? Yeah, actually 40 minutes is usually my break point. So what that person is referring to, I had this chart up here for structured testing. Sorry, now you guys got to watch the fast show here. So I had this chart up here for structure testing. I think 40 minutes, if you really want to test it right, is the time. 40 to 60. You could go all the way out to 70. Maximum lactate steady state. Usually an athlete can sustain that anywhere from 30 to 70 minutes, but going beyond 60 gets pretty rare, particularly, if you have a steeper curve. So 40 honestly gives me a pretty good number. So I think that's the question that I'm answering, but I usually go 40 or more. Now, once I have the model up and running, this literally is what I do. I'll see where there's gaps there and I might adjust it by that, again, just to keep a good, clean model. I also find it's a little easier for the athlete to do when it's, okay, today's 40, maybe this is 36, and then the next one's 51. You can kind of break it up and give them a little bit more different mentality. Nobody likes to do that long test. We all know that that's a struggle, but it is what it is. So seems like the time range to response can be tied to ramp rate. What that question is referring to is the 42, and somebody's going to pass out now in my presentation. That was too fast. When you're looking at those charts, I would say ramp rate is the cure, right, to some degree. I think you have to kind of look at all three. Yeah, I would say, because ramp rate really is how much they now get back to the uptick side. But the reality is each athlete will adjust at their, each athlete is adjusting to that training load individually. Somebody asked if their 40-minute test, will my TTE be steady at 40 then? No, not necessarily. So if you do a 40-minute test, it won't necessarily put your TTE at 40 minutes. Remember, it uses all of the data. That's all I'll say, but it uses all of the data. The model uses all of the data, so there's more to it. Even if you looked at the athlete I was showing before, their TTE was further out than their 20-minute little bubble. Do you ignore the overs in your analysis of PD curve with error calculations? As long as they're under 3%, meaning these numbers, as long as they're under 3%. I mean, think about the accuracy of a model that's predicting these numbers, right? Remember, here where it is looking at the output by watts. If I know it's under 2.5 to 3% or below, I know the physiological system is being quantified correctly. So really understand what I'm saying. I'm more concerned whether this kilojoule and this kilojoule over time is accurate versus if it's 1.1% off in watts. So I really want that to matter. You guys, anyone who doesn't want to listen to the questions, you're welcome to drop off, but I'd just like to get to them all. So that's a question to the overs, and the overs he's referring to is this. As long as it's small, that's much smaller percentage of error. What does stamina represent in terms of physiology of the athlete? I meant to attach this. If you email me at info@WKO4, I'll send you the PDF of this after the show. I meant to attach it to the webinar and I didn't. The reality is for stamina, the terms are in here. Stamina basically is a measurement of resistance fatigue during prolonged duration, right? Moderate intensity exercise. The units are a percent of maximum. So basically, just think about it this way. After you go an hour or more, right, you start dropping off. You have some fatigue coming in, which has a degradation rate of performance, right? So if your stamina is 77%, think about it this way, if you had never had any fatigue, you would be 100%. So that 77% is giving us a drop off, a quantification of the drop off. So it gives you insight in how you drop off, how you resist fatigue in that prolonged duration, moderate intensity. You asked the question, is it about fueling? Absolutely. It doesn't tell you how to train, but it's giving you insight that if your number's too low, it could be fueling. It could be training. You as the coach still have to figure out what that is. Apply some solutions and see if it gets better, right? That's exactly what the training and understanding the dose and response of analytics should do for you. So next question, I should have gone over this deeper. To get a good prediction of VO2, because I think VO2 max modeling is one of the better functions here. Most of the metrics you now train with were sort of developed to be like FTP, were sort of developed because we couldn't model VO2 max, because we couldn't get VO2 max outside of going into the lab environment. So now as we're getting better and better at modeling VO2 max, you're actually having some extremely useful data in VO2 max. The model drives the VO2 max, Buckler, so it needs the same feed the model. If you feed the model, then you'll get a reasonably accurate VO2 max. It doesn't use a time. A lot of people would say a 5-minute effort is a substitute for VO2 max. That's sort of true. It usually is between 4 and 6 minutes, but the model finds yours. So if you are extra concerned and wanted to really make sure it was right, you probably need good effort between 4 and 6 minutes. So maybe drill it for 6 minutes and you get the best you can at 4 and 6 if you really want to make sure it's accurate. All right, I'm working back, you guys. Sorry, I usually don't lose track, but that was a lot of questions. My MFTP is much higher when peaking than I can deliver compared to FTP. That's a tough question to answer. Yeah, peaking is peaking. So if you peak, the model will represent that. Andy mentioned, Coley, hey, I didn't know you were on the webinar. Andy mentioned the range of 3 to 25 minutes where there's an imprint. Yeah, so it does use all of the data. And it really uses everything, let's call it 30 minutes and below. But the reality is you got to be careful that you don't have a harder effort in that 4 to 6 minute range. That's something that can make it underrepresent. there's some math in the model that will go a little wonky if you don't have a decent 4 to 6 minute effort, which I really shouldn't say. Okay, digging back. Answered. Can we get WKO4 and TP to sync with one another so we can automatically use those? They do sync, Shane, but I think what you mean is you want the model and eye levels in training peaks. So you can use eye levels when creating workouts. That's something we are looking at doing down the road. It's more problematic to some degree. Part of the reason WKO4 is a desktop is it takes a lot of horsepower, as probably everybody knows. And there's always ways that we can do that better and better, and we're looking into those. And then two, it's you can't structure any of those workouts or do it in a fixed format because it's evolves, it's fluid. So it's on the horizon. Let's just say I don't want to give a time frame. That's not an easy project to undertake. To be honest with you, I shouldn't even say it's on the horizon. We might not be able to do it. It chews up a lot of horsepower. There's some ways we might sync them back and forth better, but you are going to see some big improvements in the back and forth syncing in 2018 for WKO4. So again, I shouldn't say that, but have you done any research on the MFTP on an athlete with good data and testing validity of holding the same power in extended TTE to measure whether lactate is stable? Have we done good testing? No. Have we tested it? Yes. We have a smaller pool of highly accurate testing, but I wouldn't say we've done a broad pool. To us, actually, statistically speaking, it's better to have small and accurate versus broad and inaccurate. And one of the articles I just linked was Frank Overton testing it a few years ago. So others have also done it. I think if you do like just Google search FTP or follow the link, but FTP maximal lactate steady state testing, there's a couple of different groups that have done it to take a look at. Somebody mentioned they still don't see the normalized residual chart. I'll make sure it's loaded if it's not. Shane asks, is there anything coming regarding individualized athlete recovery between workouts and cycles? That would be a good idea. I'll have to consider that one. That's me officially ducking the question. Adam, if you're still on, I saw one go by. Can you touch on the power duration curve profile strength and weakness charts? I have 6 athletes in WKO4. Their strength and weakness are almost exactly the same. That would be odd. I'll tell you what, if you send me some screenshots at info@WKO4, I'll answer you over the weekends with some insights. I don't want to hold up the webinar answering that. But I'll tackle it or post them in the Facebook group. I don't mind answering questions there as long as you don't mind. Just blur out their names or don't show the name. It's always a great exam or opportunity for everybody to learn. All right, I think I got all the questions, everybody. Thanks for your attentiveness and time. I appreciate using WKO4. If you have any additional questions, put them on the Facebook group. If you want this webinar PDF, sorry I did not attach it, email us at info@WKO4 and we'll send it over to you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.